Welcome everybody to tonight's really exciting Saw-Whet Owl talk. My name is Brett Thielen. I'm the Science Director with the Harris Center for Conservation Education. We are sponsoring tonight's talk. For those of you who might be new to us, I'll just say a few words about who we are and some other upcoming things to look forward to. The Harris Center is a nonprofit land trust and environmental education organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire, where we help people fall in love with the natural world. We do this through land protection, conservation research, and education of all ages. If you are local to us, we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development. Much of that's open for hiking or birding or other recreation. We coordinate conservation research projects on those lands and throughout the region through a variety of really fun community science projects. And at the heart of everything we do is education, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. We have nearly 150 events for the public every year, from Zooms like this one to guided hikes and birding outings and snowshoes. And I think with that, that's all the business part. And now it's the really fun part, which is I get the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Sean Becket of the North Branch Nature Center. He's the director of natural history programs there, and he has a rich history in natural history. He studied biology and environmental studies at Vassar. He received his master's degree from UVM's field naturalist and ecological planning program, and he's worked extensively as a wildlife ecologist. His job sounds really fun. He's researched Atlantic puffins in Maine, saw-whet owls in New York and now Vermont, raptors in Idaho, pygmy owls in Mexico, and Clark nutcrackers in Wyoming. So tonight we're here to hear about the saw-whet owl work that North Branch Nature Center is doing. They're kind of like a sister organization to the Harris Center. So we're really excited to welcome Sean. And without any further ado, take it away, Sean.
Brett, thank you so much for the introduction, and Susie and Miles, thanks very much for having me. Thanks to the whole Harris Center community. It's really a pleasure for North Branch Nature Center and the Harris Center to as I was saying before, cross-pollinate a little bit because we do such analogous work, and so it's nice to see folks tuning in from all over New England, and I imagine much farther than that too. So as Brett said, I'm the coordinator for natural history programs and community science programs over at North Branch Nature Center. And that means one of my favorite things I get to do, or actually my favorite thing I get to do all year long, is spend time with these adorable owls. So this is a saw-whet owl. And if you haven't had any experience with saw-whet owls, I want you to imagine how big you think this is. Now, imagine going to the grocery store and looking up and down the aisles at different types of bottles of liquids you can get, like a 2-liter bottle of Coke down to like a little tomato paste can or something in between. and imagine how big a saw-whet owl is in relation to what you might find in the grocery store shelf. And a saw-whet owl is about the same size as a soda can. And we'll see saw-whets are also this species that they're really common in our region, and yet almost no one has ever seen them in the wild. When I do talks like this and I ask, how many folks have ever actually seen one in the wild that wasn't being attracted by a researcher's broadcaster or being caught in nets like this, and it's very, very rare. Myself, I'm trying to think of any occasions that I've actually seen a wild saw-whet owl that I wasn't broadcasting for, and it's rare. I don't know if I've ever actually seen one. But when we think of owls in our region, we think of a couple of other species, and the saw-whet is not necessarily the first one that comes to mind. We think of owls, and we think of the owls that maybe we see up and down the telephone lines, right? In the middle of the winter, like right now, this is a great time to be driving around at dusk, looking at the power lines to see barred owls. So if you are anywhere near the woods and you encounter an owl in our region, odds are it's a barred owl. If we're at the grocery store, this is a 2-liter bottle of owl in size, and recognizable by its really big dark eyes and that barring across its back and on its wings. So a barred owl is by far, I think, the most common owl in our region, or at least the most commonly seen owl in our region. Now, if you are in a more agricultural area and you're seeing owls from time to time, maybe at the edge of a cornfield or edge of a big field, you might be seeing the other commonly seen owl of our region, the great horned owl. Now, similar in size, maybe a little bit bigger than that 2-liter bottle, but it has ear tufts on the top. Those are not actually ears, nor are they actually horns. They're actually just kind of feather plumes that are there for looks. And big yellow eyes. This is our great horned owl. So between the barred owl and the great horned owl, that makes up the majority of owls that folks see on a regular basis. But there are a lot more owls in our region than just these two. And I'll give you a second to just kind of ruminate and guess how many owls you think there are in the Northeast. Let's say New England, how many owl species we have in New England. If you want to practice the chat function, you're welcome to throw into the chat, your guess for how many owl species we have in New England. We already know there's 3, right? Barred owl, great horned owl, and saw-whet owl. There are 11 species of owls in our region, and some of them are residents here year-round. Some of them just migrate through. Some are a hybrid of those two things, like saw-whet owls are residents here, but also many do migrate through the area. Then we have some species, like the one pictured here, the northern hawk owl or the great gray owl, that are kind of visitors from the far north that appear like ghosts every 7 or 8 years in the boreal regions of our states, and kind of put on a big show for folks that discover these. They often stick around. Snowy owls, another great example of a bird that shows up in our region. That's a visitor from the high Arctic and winds up in our area once in a while. But 11 different owl species. And of all these 11 owl species, we have the smallest one, our soda can size Northern Saw-whet Owl. Saw-whets are not the smallest owl in North America, but they're the smallest one in our region. They're smaller. The other small owl we have is the Eastern Screech Owl. And if you imagine you took a great horned owl and you shrunk it down in size to like one of those large tomato cans, the 28-ounce kind, that's like an Eastern Screech Owl. Saw-whet owls even maybe a third smaller than that. So the saw-whet, it also, not only is it our smallest owl, but it's perhaps the owl that sounds least like an owl. And next time you are in the woods in the spring at night, keep an ear out for something that sounds a little bit like a truck backing up in the middle of the wilderness. There. So that toot 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 sound that you hear is the territorial call of the male saw-whet owl, and that audio file there is the exact same file that we play through a broadcaster to attract these during the migration season, which we'll get into in a little bit. So now, adorable to us, but if you're a mouse or if you're a vole, this is a fierce predator. And I love this picture because at the same time it shows how kind of small and cuddly they are on the one hand, but look at those talons, aren't they a force to be reckoned with there? So tonight we're going to kind of hit a couple different topics. First, we'll just talk a little bit about the distribution of saw-whet owls in our region and across North America. We will get into the life history of this bird a little bit, how it goes about its day and its night. We'll talk about adaptations that saw-whets and other owls have to be able to actually do what they do. And then we'll transition over to talking about how we actually catch owls as researchers and what we can learn from that research as well. So saw-whet owls, this is a range map from eBird of all saw-whet owl reports across North America of all time. And basically anything that has a color on this map other than gray is a place where a saw-whet owl has been seen. Now pay attention to the purple color, and you'll see that our region, I'm over in Montpelier, Vermont, and many of you are down over in New Hampshire. Our region is purple. That's the year-round range of saw-whet owls. And so you'll see that kind of around our latitude here in the Northeast and over in the Great Lakes, there's a year-round population. You could go outside right now and theoretically find a saw-whet owl if you really put your mind to it. But if we look to the north, going all the way up to St. James Bay in Quebec, really up to the edge of the tree line, is their breeding range. And if we look down to the south into the blue colors and the yellow colors, that is their kind of their wintering range. And so you'll see that after the breeding season, they head south and they wind up down in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, even all the way down into the Carolinas. And there's even some intrepid banders that have their fingers crossed down in northern Florida that catch them once in a great while too. But we are really in the core of the saw-whet owl range here in our region. And what's extra special is that we are in between. Not only are we in a year-round range for saw-whets, but we're also right in the middle of the migratory corridor for the eastern population of the species. They come from many of the species that are summering up in that red zone. They come down through our area, through the Appalachians, and they winter either here or farther south. But you'll see they're distributed all the way across the northern hemisphere. Really, anywhere there's trees, right? There's going to be saw-whet owls, or I should say anywhere there's dense forests, there's going to be saw-whet owls. And those forests can look a lot of different ways. You know, this is looking off the top of a mountain in Vermont. It could be mixed hardwoods. It could be like this up in the Rockies. It could be more conifers. It really doesn't totally matter what type of northern forest you have. If you have intact interior forest, that is what saw-whet owls need. That's kind of their main habitat requirement. And the particular pieces that they need within that forest are also fairly straightforward, right? If you're going to live in the forest, you need something to eat, and their major prey is the red-backed vole. So, and in some places they eat a lot of deer mice too, but really first and foremost, the red-backed vole is their major prey source. If you don't know what a vole is, imagine a mouse and you shrink the ears a little bit and you take the tail and you make it about a third of the length and you have a vole. So it's a small rodent, small mammal, and they are abundant in forested areas. In open fields, we have meadow voles. In the forest, we have red-backed voles. And I put these two maps side by side here to kind of hopefully illustrate how generally speaking, the range of the saw-whet owl overlaps very closely with the range of the red-backed vole. This owl is a specialist on small rodents, and in the woods, those voles are really the key piece of that diet. So since we're talking about life history, let's talk a little bit more about life history and how they go about doing their thing. On the left, this is an adult. On the right, this is a juvenile. So I should actually, this is a good, I'm remembering one of the things that I often get as a question when we show the public saw-whet owls, they think, oh, that must be a baby owl, right? It's the size of a soda can. How could that, how much bigger is it going to get? But in fact, as soon as birds leave the nest, this is true for pretty much all birds, maybe except ground nesters. When birds leave the nest, they're basically full size. In some cases, they're actually bigger than their parents. And the only difference is often their plumage. So on the left is an adult, on the right is a juvenile. And by the time that this bird on the right kind of grows up a little bit and is ready for its first migratory season, it's already going to look like its adult plumage. So a bird that's born in May or June, up in Canada, say, by the time we see it in Vermont in October, it already has its adult plumage. We never see a bird like the one that's pictured on the right. So if you're wandering around the woods and you've recently won the lottery and you come across not only a saw-whet owl, but a juvenile saw-whet owl that looks like this, you know that you're very close to a saw-whet nest because they molt out of that juvenile plumage into their first basic plumage pretty quickly throughout the summer. So you'll notice that the bird on the left is sitting in a little tree cavity, and that's no coincidence. These saw-whet owls are cavity nesters. That's the other piece that they need in a forest. Not only do they need voles to eat, but they need holes in trees in order to make a nest, right? Now, saw-whets, they don't excavate their own nest holes. They do what a lot of other cavity nesters do, which is rely on the nests of other species. So, or the cavities made by other species. So, if you go into the woods and look up at a tree cavity one year, a flying squirrel could pop out of it. You go back the next year and a hairy woodpecker could come out. And then you go back the next year and there might be, a tufted titmouse or a chickadee that's in there. And you go back the fourth year and there's a saw-whet owl. And so there's like high value real estate in the woods in these tree cavities. And so any tree cavity that's a few inches in diameter, a saw-whet might take advantage of for its nest. On the right, this is a picture of some saw-whet owl eggs and a chick. This is a nest in captivity, which you might guess by the wood shavings in the bottom, as well as the fact that we just talked about how their main prey are voles, and these are mice here, and all on the bottom left there's a dead bird as well. So I'm not sure what the deal is with that, but suffice it to say that these owls lay small round white eggs. They lay 4 to 7 of them or thereabouts, and they're breeding in this period kind of between April and August, let's say. April and May, they're kind of courting, they're searching for, pairs of owls are searching for the right cavity. They're laying their eggs. A month later, those eggs hatch. A month later, those chicks fledge. And a couple months after that, the migration has already begun, which we'll get into the migration a little bit later. So what makes an owl special? We talked about kind of where they live and what they need, but how do they make a living and how do they actually go about eating those voles and mice? Everything about an owl is specialized to being able to do what they do, which is hunt things in the dark very, very quietly, right? First of all, these owls have huge eyes, right? That's kind of, if you just like write a list of things that make an owl, one of those things will probably on your list will be that it has big eyes. And in fact, their eyes are so big that they can't move their eyes in their socket, right? In order for them to look from left to right, they actually have to move their entire head. Their eyes are so big, there's no room in the socket left for the muscles that actually move those eyes around. And so the trade-off there is that they can see extremely well in very, very low light conditions. So even in near pitch black, they can hunt visually in the woods with hardly any problem at all. Next thing you might notice on your list of what makes an owl is that they're very fluffy, right? Which is part of their adorable factor. But that fluffiness serves a few different important purposes. In the north, that fluff, those extra feathers, are insulative, and it allows them to stay warm on nights like this, where right now it's actually below 0 outside at my place in Montpelier, but I'm sure the saw-whets don't mind. But that fluff also is a noise baffle. If you've ever been outside and you've heard a raven or a goose or something like that fly by you, behind you, it sounds almost like a little mini like fighter jet, right? They make a lot of noise. A lot of birds make a lot of noise when they fly by. And that's generally because, the wing is an airfoil, and that air, as it splits over the wing, kind of rips and it makes a bunch of noise. Now, if you're a vole or a mouse and you're wandering around at night, the last thing that the thing that you're probably the most attuned to in your life is the sound, excuse me, of wings coming in from behind. And owls have an adaptation to kind of protect against this. The very leading edge of their feathers. So right up here, and I assume you can see my cursor, but just give me a thumbs up or, okay, great. So right on the leading edge of their first flight feathers right here is this serration. And that serration breaks up the air and it creates kind of turbulence, so the air isn't ripping over that airfoil and it quiets things down. On the tail edge of those wings too, it's a little bit serrated as well to kind of act as a noise baffle there. And their body feathers, of course, are real fluffy as well. So they fly silently. They can fly, they can catch prey in the near dark, and they can do so without making any noise at all. In fact, I'm reminded of a time where we were doing some saw-whet surveys, and we had a broadcaster playing the sound of a barred owl to try to see if there were barred owls in the area. And we played it for a while, didn't see anything. We turned around to leave, and sitting on a branch right behind us was a barred owl that had flown in so silently that we didn't even know that it landed 2 feet behind us and was there for several minutes. So not only can these owls hunt in the near darkness, they can also hunt. They could even hunt if they're blindfolded. Owls have spectacular hearing, right? That facial disc that also is on your list of things that make an owl, right? That facial disc is like a radar dish almost, right? It kind of catches sound and it funnels it into the ear canals. But beyond that, those ear canals have a very interesting evolutionary history. These are a couple of photos of other species, other owl species skulls, and you'll notice that they're not symmetrical left to right. Right, this ear canal over here on the left is set higher up, and you might notice that it's actually set farther back than this one here that's set down low and farther forward. Now, what this does is it allows owls to hear in 3 dimensions. So in the same way that I know how far away this pencil is because I have a left eye giving me one cue and a right eye giving me a slightly different cue, and the brain kind of puts those 2 signals together to give me a sense of depth. Owls are doing the same thing with their ears because sound is hitting one ear slightly differently than the other ear, which allows them to triangulate their prey. In the bottom right, this is kind of a gnarly looking picture, but everything is fine here, I promise. This is what's happening here is we're basically just gently moving the feathers out of the way of this facial disc right here to reveal the size of the ear canal behind that facial disc. You can actually see the back of the eye socket right here. And the ear canals. I mean, it seems like half of the owl's head is just ear canals. Kind of wild. So anyway, they're really, really great at catching mice, but we're also really great at catching them. How's that for a segue? So let's transition away from talking about saw-whet life history and talk about how we actually go about as researchers catching these saw-whet owls. So we'll go through all the methods that we do and kind of some of the safety precautions that we take and all of this. And then we'll transition into what we've learned from this sort of research that we do. So the question that we often get is, how do you actually catch an owl in the woods? And they have this vision of researchers running around with butterfly nets, like in the darkness in the forest, swinging at saw-whet owls. And while that's a great image, unfortunately, it's not. That's not what we do. Although this, I guess, is partially true because we do use nets, but we don't use butterfly nets. We use what are called mist nets. And mist nets are, they're kind of like the evolution of a fisherman's gill net. And in fact, way back in the day, decades ago, before mist nets were developed, bird researchers would use gill nets for catching songbirds and whatnot. So I'm glad we've moved away from that. But essentially, it's really fine mesh netting that when you hold it in your hand, it almost feels weightless. And you can see it in this photograph because it's against a bright blue sky. But if there was a forest behind this, it would be almost invisible. And there's these long horizontal runners that go across this net. And what that does is it creates a space for there to be kind of this big pocket of excess netting. And these nets, by the way, they're about 40 feet long and they're about 8 feet tall. And so we take these and we set them up in the woods, and we set them up in like a triangle pattern or a big square or something like that. And right in the middle of that arrangement, we put a boombox or a big megaphone that plays the territorial sound of the male saw-whet owl, that same tooting that you heard before. So owls, as they're migrating by in the fall, after they finish their nesting season, the chicks have fledged, they've grown up, they start moving their way south to warmer, or not necessarily warmer places, but places with better access to food in the middle of January. They're flying through and they hear a territorial male song, and they are curious and they're attracted to that. They come in and they get caught in the net. Now, when an owl flies into a net, it's not like the same thing as like if you're playing tennis and you like whack the tennis ball into the net. It's not gonna like slam into anything. It's a very soft process. It's more like a like catching an egg with a baseball glove or something. These nets are designed to catch the owl and to kind of spring, and then to hold the owl down in a pocket so that the owl isn't experiencing any trauma in this process. You also might expect that if an owl is stuck in the net like this, that it gets horribly tangled, but that's actually most of the time not the case. They usually fly into the net, they hang down in this pocket, and they kind of just chill out like they're in a hammock for the half an hour in between our net checks while we're waiting for them to fly in. So you can see here a couple owls that are caught in the net. There's one over here just on the left is hardly caught at all. We could just reach in through through the pocket from out of screen to the top and just pull that owl right out in a couple of seconds. Same with the one on the right here. Earlier today, I got this great video sent over from banders over in New Paltz, who put an infrared camera on their nets so they could actually see what it looks like for owls to fly into the net here. So this is kind of a video of what it's like to be caught as a saw-whet. They fly slowly through the woods hunting, and they hit the net and they kind of drop down in this pocket here. So nice and springy. It's like a trampoline hammock. Oh, that one got out of one trammel and then flew back and got caught in the next. Anyway, so we extract the owls from the net. And this is probably a good time to mention that we have extensive training in this, and this is not easy to do. And it's something that we have master banding permits for. We have extensive training in how to not only do all the banding work, but how to safely set up these nets, how to do so in ways that will keep the birds healthy and safe, how to extract them safely, all of this. This is a very safe process. When all the methods are being followed, this is very, very safe for the birds. I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but the methodology that we use is standardized across all saw-whet owl banding stations across North America. And we work very, very hard to make sure that we're all doing things with best available practices, safest way possible. And I'm really proud to say that when we do this, birds do not get hurt. Should mention all that because following it up with this, one might think that these birds are a little bit upset with what's going on here. But allow me to explain. So when we get the bird out of the net, the next thing we do is we put it into a little kind of owl stein like this. So if anybody has ever seen a falconer live birds of prey demonstration, you know that oftentimes the falconer will put like a leather hood over the bird's head. Or if you have horses or anything like that, often, with a lot of pets and a lot of animals, kind of covering their eyes is a good way to kind of keep the animals calm, and it's no exception here. We put them kind of into these cans here so that it's nice and dark and it's quiet, and they're in there comfortably, but not compressed so much that they can't breathe or anything. Their feathers are kind of holding them all in place, but they can't struggle around and get out. So nice, comfortable, easy holding place for them. The other sides of these cans have a lot of air holes in them so they can breathe. And just to calibrate your supermarket shelf selection here, these are tomato paste cans that we're talking about here. And these are actually, each one of these owls is 2 tomato paste cans kind of taped together. And they fit in there very comfortably. And you can see that we catch a lot of these owls. In certain years and in certain places, we can catch many owls in a single night. And I think our record actually was when we were down in New York. I think 37 in a night was our record over in New Paltz, where I used to band at Vassar, and at the Nature Center, I think our record was 27 in a single night. And so we have our hands literally full with owls sometimes. So every half an hour we go out and we check our nets, and any owls that are caught in there we take out and we bring back. We bring back in this kind of safety container, and then one at a time the first thing we do is we put a band on their leg. So this here on the bottom right is a aluminum leg band that's issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's this whole system that's managed by them and the USGS. Any bird that's banded in anywhere in North America is going to get one of these standardized aluminum leg bands, and it has a special serial number on it that's unique to that bird. And all of the data that we collect, regardless of what species, regardless of what we're doing, any bird that is banded, all our information goes back to the centralized bird banding laboratory. That is kind of the clearinghouse and repository for all this data. So that if we catch a bird that already has a band on it, we can go to the Bird Banding Lab website, report the band number, and immediately know where that bird was banded and by who and when, and all this information about it. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. So we put a band on the bird's leg, and we have these special pliers to do it with, which has a hole in the pliers at the same diameter as the band, so that clamping the band down on the leg is not going to collapse the band against it or anything like that. The band itself is less than a gram in weight. It's very, very light. This is one tomato paste can stuffed with an owl. And bring this up to say that we actually do a lot of our work with the owl still in the can, like putting the band on and taking some measurements and things like that. We do what we can without even taking the owl out, so that we can minimize the amount of time that the owl is out and minimize the amount of handling that we have to do with the birds as we go. So here's Gavin banding an owl right in one of those steins here. So after we put the band on the bird's leg, we take some measurements. We measure their wing length, and then we take their mass. We put them on a scale and figure out how much they weigh. And by the way, owls, I was looking up, in our supermarket analogy here, I was looking up what an owl weighs. A large saw-whet owl weighs the same as a stick of butter. 113 grams is like a good stick of butter, and that's about the size of a robust saw-whet owl. But these owls, they range in weight quite a bit, from about 75 grams to maybe 115 grams or so. That's a big range for a bird. It's like what, 40% variation. And we take the wing length and we take their weight in order to figure out whether they're male or female. Because with almost all birds of prey, there's a big sexual size dimorphism. And what that means is that one sex is bigger than the other. And in birds of prey, usually it's the female that's larger than the male. There's a few different reasons for why that might be. If you're a bigger bird, you can maybe lay more. You can lay more eggs, and perhaps that's why females are larger. There's also thoughts that by males and females being different sizes, they can specialize in different types of prey, so they're not competing with one another around their nest for food. But suffice it to say that female saw-whet owls are quite a bit bigger than male saw-whet owls. And so we take some measurements to figure out who's who. Some stations, they collect some DNA as well. This is all I can think of here is getting like a COVID test in the shot, but this owl is not getting tested. It's just getting a little cheek swab to get some cheek tissue cells on this swab for DNA analysis. And there's all sorts of cool things you can figure out with DNA. So we've taken all the measurements, we put a band on it. All of this has taken about maybe 5 minutes to do all of this. And then the next part is my favorite part, which is the part where you actually get to let these birds go. And there's an important and really handy and serendipitous dovetailing between community engagement here and research safety, because these birds, we can't just release them right from the banding station, because they've been under the lights and we need their eyes to readjust to the darkness so that when they fly away, they can go and safely find a perch. So what that means is we need to bring the owls out into the darkness and hold them there for a couple of minutes, letting the eyes readjust before letting it go. Now, if we have a whole bunch of owls that we need to be banding, it can be really time consuming to be waiting around for one owl's eyes to adjust while we're banding another. And so what we'll often do is we'll invite members of the public to actually do that release process for us, supervised, of course. But really, like, you can say anything you want about all the data that is being collected, the research that's being published, the things we're finding out about this species, how it has conservation implications in terms of population management, all of that. But the most important thing for me is what's happening right here, right? There's like 300 people listening to me talk because these saw-whet owls are adorable and fluffy and amazing. And that's no coincidence, right? These are amazing wildlife ambassadors. And the opportunity to be able to invite the public to be part of this research and actually watch this and have a hands-on encounter with these owls, it's life-changing. It changed my life the first time that it happened to me, and now I still do this 12 years later. And so the last part of our process is to find a a good volunteer and train them how to hold this owl safely, take the requisite photos, and we get one pet on the head, and then take it out into the dark and release it back to back into the woods, and on they go with their migration. Some folks often ask, do you catch the same owl again and again and again and again? Because if you're releasing into a place where it can hear the broadcaster that it just flew into, and generally speaking, they don't fly back. Once they get caught and released, they just keep going south or they leave the area. So that's our research process. And now let's transition into what this information is good for, all this banding data that we collected, whatnot. So I'm going to kind of like time warp back and forth here between the research that we're doing at North Branch Nature Center right now and the research that I published as part of my undergrad work at Vassar College 10 years ago, and how the process that I just explained bears out in terms of things that we can find out about this species. We used to think that saw-whets were really rare. We used to think they were endangered, in fact, because nobody ever sees them. And for a long time, that's what everybody thought, until one day, many decades ago, there was like a dozen saw-whet owls that washed up on the shores of Lake Superior in one night. And so researchers thought, well, how could this species be endangered if the 12 of them washed up after one storm on one lake? And so folks resolved to start trying to figure out how to actively search for these birds. And so one thing led to another. A lot of hand waving here in terms of the timeline, but now we have hundreds of banders across the country that are actively doing this banding process to get a sense of what the population of saw-whet owls looks like. So this map here it's like 10 years old, but it hasn't been updated, so this is the best I got. But every one of these red dots is a bird banding, saw-whet owl banding station. So you can see that if a bird is flying from St. James Bay and is trying to end up somewhere in North Carolina, there's a lot of opportunities for it to run into some nets. And today there would be a lot more dots on this map because there's a lot of banders that have started up in the last 10 years. So what we did for our research was basically to figure out some basic biological questions about these birds. Where are they going? Where are they coming from? That sort of thing. So what we did was we went to that bird banding laboratory and we said, hey, we would like a database of all of the data you have of all saw-whet owls that have ever been encountered, ever been banded. And so they promptly sent us back a database of 200,000 plus saw-whet owls that had been banded over the 30 years prior. And so that's a lot of data to work with. So the first thing we did was we thought, okay, how many of those 200,000 birds were banded and then recaptured somewhere else? And we looked at that, and that made us toss out 198,000 records, and we were left with about 2,000 or 3,000 records of birds that were banded somewhere and recaptured somewhere else. And we drew lines between the banding point and the recapture point, and this is what it looks like. So every one of these lines represents a bird that was banded somewhere and recaptured somewhere else. Now, the thing that's misleading about this, and the next map I'll show you too, is that this doesn't necessarily mean that they were banded and recaptured in the same year. And so like this line over here, that of a bird that was banded, here and then recaptured over here, that doesn't necessarily mean that it flew this direction. Maybe it was banded here in one year, then recaptured over here the next year. So just know that these are multiple years happening. But this big pile of spaghetti dropped on top of Eastern North America here does actually tell us some interesting things. To simplify this, let's just take the first 5 years of North Branch Nature Center's banding information and do the same thing. And this is what that looks like. So here we are up in Montpelier. We had another little satellite station over at Shelburne Bay for a couple of years in the beginning. But each one of these lines represents a bird that we banded and was recaptured somewhere else, or a bird that was banded somewhere else and we recaptured it. And so it was pretty amazing that in the first 5 years of banding, we already had this much connection with other nature centers and research stations around the Northeast via our owls. I've been joking that I'm going to release an owl with a little note attached to his leg when I send it south and see if any, like a message in a bottle. kind of thing, because these owls really do show up, in other locations with a pretty high frequency compared to most other banding efforts. When you band a songbird, a warbler, a chickadee, something like that, your likelihood of finding it again is very, very low, like less than 1%. And the likelihood of finding it somewhere else again is even lower than that. But with saw-whets, somewhere between like 2 and 5% of saw-whet owls actually show up again at another banding station or your own, which is really, really great. Okay, so that was kind of what we were, what we were first interested in. And this was kind of the first 5 years of the North Branch Nature Center data that I'm showing here. What I want to do now is kind of do this little time warp where I'm going to introduce you. We're going to talk about bring up a basic question that we just did not have the answers to before doing saw-whet owl banding as a field. And I'll introduce you to a particular owl at the Nature Center that we caught that helped illustrate what we learned. So first basic biology question that we want to know is, how long do saw-whet owls live? This is a wild animal that no one ever sees, and we can figure out how long they live in captivity, but how long do they live in the wild? And so what we did was, well, the first owl I'll introduce you to is this one here, and he's affectionately, or she is affectionately known as 1014821112. And she was banded down at the Glendinning Nature Preserve way down in Maryland. And that was in 2016. And she was recaptured by us 4 years later last year in Vermont, 434 miles away. But remember, the bird didn't fly directly from one to the other. What happens is, anyway, the bird's migrating up and down from Canada to the Appalachians, Canada, Appalachians. And one fall, it wound up in a net in Maryland, and then 4 years later, it wound up in a net in Vermont. Anyway, 82112 here illustrates really a fabulous rarity in saw-whets, which is that this is a very old bird. We took all of that bird banding lab information about birds that were banded and then recaptured and asked ourselves, how many years is it, what's the frequency of the number of years between when birds are banded and when they're recaptured? And our data kind of look like this. So on the y-axis here, we have the number of saw-whet owls in the data set. And on the x-axis here, we have number of years between when a bird was banded and when it was recaptured. So if a bird's going to be recaptured, 17% of those are recaptured in the same year, either at the same site or farther south. 37% of the birds are recaptured the next year. 25% of the birds are recaptured 2 years later than that, and 12% the year after that. And what this basically adds up to is that 91% of all saw-whet owls that have ever been recaptured are recaptured less than 3 years or less after their original banding date. This really gives us a great age curve of how long the average saw-whet owl lives, right? It is extraordinarily rare to find a saw-whet owl, to recapture a saw-whet owl 4 or 5 or 6 or beyond years after banding. And it's not because they get shy of the nets. They're only ever caught twice. All of these birds in this data set are only ever caught twice. And but yeah, this is basically showing us that, yeah, saw-whet owls, if a saw-whet owl lives a nice, good life, it might live 3 years. And if you're really lucky, maybe 4 or 5. So the next thing we were wondering is, okay, how fast do these birds migrate? What does their migration look like? We know they're moving from points north through our region and ending up in points south, but how do they actually do that? We know examples of birds like red knots and Arctic terns and all of our warblers and things like that they'll go up into the jet stream and they'll just cruise, and they'll fly hundreds of miles or thousands of miles without stopping. And we were wondering, okay, do saw-whets do that, or do they do more like what a robin or a goose does, which is just kind of edging their way south as it's convenient for them, or is it something in between? So I'll introduce you to 1104-21259, which perfectly illustrates what we found out. So this bird was banded last year on October 14th and recaptured exactly 1 month later, 500 miles south in Virginia, which is like perfectly illustrating how fast these saw-whet owls move. I think that's 16 miles a day if you do the math. So they're really just kind of leapfrogging their way through the trees over the course of the day, hunting their way south. So we wanted to, so this bird kind of illustrates the point, but when we were looking at the bird banding lab data, we wanted to figure out, okay, as a population, what does this migration look like? So we came up with this kind of interesting strategy where we took the whole country and we laid latitude lines across it, almost like rungs of a ladder. And we binned all of the Saw-Whet Owl captures, all the banding stations, all the birds that were captured into these latitude bars. And we asked ourselves, what is the average, what is like the peak of the migration window, like the peak season of migration? Like if there's a bell curve of when owls are moving through the area, when's the peak of that bell curve at any given latitude line? We map it all out, and this is essentially what that looks like. These numbers here, 276 all the way up to 324, this is what's called like the Julian day, so like the day of the year. So like January 1st is 1, and February 1st is like what, 32, and so on and so forth. And so 276 is October 1st. So these owls, these banding stations that are operating up here, they're seeing the peak of their migration at the beginning of October. In our region, we're seeing it in mid-October. Down in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they're encountering birds around Halloween, November 1st, and birds that travel farther than that aren't being picked up down there in any great numbers until middle of November or so. So this gave us just a great way of getting a sense of what this migration really looks like, how fast they move, etc. So the next question, again, these are basic biology questions. You'd think we'd have answers to these, but we don't, or we didn't. And this research that we're doing, this banding data, is the exact method that we use to figure out these basic questions of this bird's biology. Do they follow the same path from year to year? This is a really interesting one with lots of implications around conservation, right? If an owl is, if let's say an owl is nesting up in like St. James Bay and near there and up in like northern Quebec, and it migrates south, is it going to migrate south one year through the Appalachians and migrate south the next year and end up over in the Rockies? Is it going to come down over or is it going to go over, Lake Superior, or is it going to go to the Atlantic coast? Like how much what's called migration route fidelity do these birds have? And that can help us understand if they do warrant conservation. Is their migratory corridor an important thing to be able to understand and protect? So I'll introduce you to 1104-34470, which is one of our favorite owls and has an honorary membership at North Branch Nature Center because it is a vanishingly rare case of a bird that was recaptured 3 times. And not only that, it was recaptured in the same place 3 times. So it was banded in 2017 at the Nature Center. It was recaptured in 2018, and it was recaptured again in 2019, all right here. And so that right there illustrates, really anecdotally what we need to know. But again, let's turn our attention back to the population-wide data here. And we came up with another little kind of clever thought experiment here. So what we did was we said, let's say there's an owl up here somewhere far north, and year 1, it migrates south along this path, and it gets caught at this red dot, which is a banding station. It gets caught at this banding station here. Now let's say this bird then winters somewhere south, flies back north, and the following fall, it migrates down this way, and it gets caught at this other banding station that happens to be at the same latitude, but it's over here. So we looked at all the instances of birds that were banded and recaptured at the same latitude in different years, and asked ourselves, what's the average distance between those 2 points? This is going to take some interpretation. Don't stress this one too much. But basically, all of the orange circles here, those show birds that were banded and recaptured in different years in the exact same spot. And the green lines show a bird that was banded in one spot and recaptured somewhere else within the same latitude. But better way to show the results here is this. On the left here, we have percent of owls. And then on the bottom here, we have the distance between where they were banded and where they were recovered or recaptured in kilometers. So 30% of the birds that were banded and recaptured at the same latitude in different years were recaptured less than 20 kilometers away from where they were originally banded. And over 60 or nearly 70% of them were banded less than 50 kilometers away. And the 70% less than 100 kilometers away. And so the moral of the story here is that these owls do have a very high migration route fidelity. They tend to be following very similar migration corridors from year to year, but not always. There are plenty of examples that the outliers of a bird that is banded in one spot one year and then banded real far away the next. We had a case where a bird that we banded a bird that was captured by Lake Michigan was recaptured by us the following year way over here in Vermont. So there are outliers, but the majority have pretty good migration route fidelity. Another interesting question that we asked, I don't have an owl to introduce you to for this one, but the simple question, do males and female saw-whet owls migrate the same or differently? Those of you that pay attention to birds in one way or another, you might know that red-winged blackbirds tend to show up ridiculously early in the spring. Red-winged blackbird males will show up in the middle of March or the end of March, and then they'll just get hammered on in a snowstorm for a couple of weeks before things really warm up. And then a few weeks after that, when it's actually like a reasonable time to migrate back, all the females show up. And the idea here is that males are arriving back on territory early because the sooner you can get back to favorable breeding territory, the better you can defend that against other competitors. So we wanted to know, are owls doing the same thing? Are males tending to migrate differently than females? And so what we did was we looked at the male to female ratio of birds caught at every single banding station and bin those into latitudes and looked at what their male to female ratio is kind of across space. Now, the crazy thing is that at every single banding station, period, there's always way more females than males. Like to the order of we kept 10 females for every one male, or 10 to 2, or sometimes 10 to 3, but way more females than males. And the reason for this has to be either that the broadcaster is repelling males away, because if you're a 70-gram male saw-whet owl and you hear this loud bellowing from a loudspeaker in the woods of the loudest saw-whet owl you've ever heard, that might scare you away from that as a potential competitor. On the flip side, females might be preferentially attracted to that broadcaster because they're attracted to the sound of territorial male saw-whets. We don't know the answer to that exactly, but what we do know is that if you put up a bunch of nets in the woods with no broadcaster at all, you're not going to catch many saw-whets, but what you do catch is going to be an even 50-50 sex ratio. So in the wild, saw-whet owls do have a 50-50 sex ratio, but at our stations, it's heavily skewed female. But the fantastic thing we figured out was that the farther north you go, the more males you do, the more males you do encounter. It's still heavily preference towards females at the stations, but there's many more males. So up here at northern latitudes, it's like 0.2 sex ratio, or 0.2 to 0.3 male to female ratio. And as we go farther south, it's more like 0.1. So all that to say that the interpretation for this is that males aren't migrating as far south. And the conclusion one might draw from that is if you're a male trying to get back to territory and you are in South Carolina, you have a long way to go to get back to territory. And by the time you get there, your territory might have been taken by another competitor. And so we suspect that saw-whet owls are hanging out farther north, closer to their breeding range than females are, which tend to be winding up at points farther south. Last question that we can all kind of ask together is, what's the value of this work really? We talked about some of the things that we can figure out in terms of the population data, some of these questions around natural history and ecology, their movement, their life history, population estimates. So from a scientific standpoint, there's lots of things still to be learned just at the basic level about this species. But there's also a lot, there's other ways in which this work is really, really valuable to us as researchers, to us as educators, And for that, I'll introduce you to 1104-34477. And this bird was banded on a youth retreat we were doing up in the Nullhegan Basin in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, where we set up some owl nets as part of this youth retreat. And we caught 3 owls. And these are, young, young 10 to 13-year-olds that we're up there with, who have a passion for natural history and are really jazzed about, birding and insects and all of it. And we caught this owl. Well, just about a month later, that owl was recaptured. The owl that they caught was recaptured way down in Pennsylvania by Scott Weidenzahl. And Scott Weidenzahl is one of the nation's preeminent authors of about birds. He's a New York Times bestseller. He's written A World on the Wing, Living on the Wind. He's a great, really well-known author. And just for our students to be able to connect with kind of like one of the heavyweight bird biologists in the country through this shared experience of this one particular owl is something that resonates really strongly with them and with us, and just paints a picture of just how important this work is, not just from the standpoint of figuring out, the percentages and statistics, but also being able to build connections between people and understand who and what is living in their backyard and who they share their forests with. So to that extent, my last slide here is one with a little bit of personality. And it just goes to show that, like, we're talking about a species here, right? In the general sense, we're talking about Northern Saw-Whet owls. But just like when you say the word human, that can look like a lot of different things. Same with a saw-whet. These are 7 different saw-whet owls, and you can just see how much personality, what kind of different personalities each one of these birds has. Looking from one to one. Some I won't anthropomorphize too much, but I think that's really fascinating how every bird that we get is really an individual, and that's a fun thing to be able to share with folks as well. That this isn't just about catching a row in a data set, but it's about interacting with a particular individual that's representing its species and is providing for us a little bit of conservation value at the expense of a few minutes of discomfort in a tomato paste can. So with that, I would be delighted to answer any questions. Oh, I do want to say, we have an Adopt an Owl program at the Nature Center. I would be remiss to not mention this. One of the things that funds our ability to do this work is our Adopt an Owl program. And so if you go to our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org, you can find our owl banding page there. You can learn more about what we do. On there, there's also a link to our online bird banding station, where you can actually watch a video of me actually banding and processing and doing all this stuff kind of live on camera. But also on that site is a place where you can adopt an owl. So if you want to support this research, what we do is we send you a certificate. It's a symbolic adoption. We don't mail you an owl or anything. It's a symbolic adoption. We send you a certificate, and it has an owl's picture on it, a band number, all of the information we collected on that bird. And if that bird ever shows up anywhere else in North America ever again, which, as we talked about, happens a lot, we send you an update of the whereabouts of your owl. So if you're interested in supporting this research, that's a great way to do it. You can go to our website for that. And I already know that we're going to have probably more questions than we have time for. So I just want to throw it out there right up front that if we don't get to your questions, there's my email address, Sean@northbranchnaturecenter.org. Send me an email. I'd be happy to correspond with you about anything you'd like. So with that, I will pass the baton back to Brett and Miles and Susie and say thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. This was fantastic and just full of amazing information. We are a little over time, so if you have to go, that's fine. If you'd like to stay just a few minutes, we'll ask just 2 or 3 of there were many great questions that came in, but we don't have time for them all. But if you'd like to stay a few extra minutes, as long as Sean can, we'll ask a few of them. One, I think, is a quick one, which is, what time, well, 2 really, I think they're related questions. Do saw-whets ever get captured at non-saw-whet banding stations? And possibly a related question, what time of the day do saw-whets migrate?
Yep. So they're migrating at night, and they're migrating really, as we talked about in our area, like the middle of the month of October is our banding window. And they migrate as soon as the sun goes down. As soon as it's dark, that's when we open the nets, and we often start catching owls within that first hour after dark. There's often a lull after about midnight or so, and things tend to move. Things that are migrating tend to do most of their movement, in the first 4 or 5 hours of darkness, but they're moving at night. And then I already forgot the other question.
Do they ever get captured at other non-Saw-Whet stations?
It's rare, but yes. I think the folks with Vermont Center for Eco Studies were doing their Bicknell's thrush research up on top of Mount Mansfield and the spine of the greens, and they've caught a Saw-Whet owl or two in their nets just passively in the process. But it's pretty darn rare.
Because the difference of most bird banders are banding in the daylight hours, and most Saw-Whets are moving at the night.
Yeah. Well, the bird banders, the songbird banders, their protocols are to open right at sunrise, and so there's still some owls that still haven't quite settled down right at sunrise. I should mention too, another kind of like real quick question that we often get is, how many Saw-Whet owls are there out in the world for a species that we never see? The estimate is somewhere around 2 million of them are draped across our northern forests. We catch 100 at our last Saw-Whet owl season. We caught 130 or 140 birds in the month of October, just at our station alone.
Wow. There's a number of nesting questions, and several people have asked if they return to the same nest site every year, and if they'll use if you put up a nest box, will they come back to it?
Yeah, you can put up nest boxes for Saw-Whets. And there's specifications, for doing that. It does take, if they're going to use it, it's going to take a long time for them to come around to wanting to use that box. I say that because my first role as a freshman in college was to go and hang 100 nest boxes in the woods, in the Catskills in New York, and we returned to monitor them and had exactly 0 Saw-Whet owls, even though we knew they nested in those woods somewhere. This is something we don't have a lot of great research for, because where they do nest is often far north. There's not a lot of people, and it's hard to get into and stuff. Hard to document these nests. But I think it's fair to say that they do have some fidelity to the region that they're nesting in. Maybe even the same locale, not necessarily the same cavity from year to year. They'll often go to different cavities.
All right, and maybe one last question from someone watching on YouTube about the information from the banding process. Can you tell how old an owl is when it was first banded?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I didn't talk about that, but that is something that we do, is we age our owls. And am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me just go back to the owls in a can thing here. Okay, so owls have a really interesting molt pattern where they don't molt all of their flight feathers at once, and they don't even molt them all in the same year. Most songbirds, they kind of go through a full molt in a single year, and so it's hard to just look at a bird real quick and figure out how old it is. But with Saw-Whets, you can open up their wings, and you can look at the pattern of which feathers are new to which ones are old, and you can figure out if a bird was born that year, was born the year before that, born the year before that, or born some other year previously. So we have some resolution on this. And I go back to this picture just because you can actually see it in this image. You'll see that some of this here are the tucked up flight feathers of the birds. And you can see that some of these are the color of like milk chocolate, and some are the color of dark chocolate. Those dark chocolate are new feathers, and that milk chocolate is old feathers. And so it's quite easy to see with just the naked eye how old the bird is to a certain point. After it gets like 3 years old, then it's really hard to tell.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sean. This was really fascinating. We're so grateful for you sharing your knowledge and experience. There's clearly such huge enthusiasm for tiny owls, and so we're really grateful to you for sharing that with us. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you didn't get to your question, please feel free to email Sean, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks, Sean.